A country of gas guzzlers, a country of raw materials, a breeding ground for hawks. The village prison of nations, as the Anglo-Saxons call this vast territory. From childhood, we feel the influence of the people, which tries with all its might to instill in us a sense of our own inferiority, and many succumb to this. And young boys and girls and adults, scholars and businessmen try to live here for happy foreign lands further away from their homeland. However, despite this, over the course of centuries, if not millennia, everyone who is not lazy tries to seize this useless and worthless territory. So what are you? Rus, Russian Empire, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Russian Federation, Great Empire, owning 1/7 of the entire planet's land. Or dead tundra and Siberian wastelands, foodless Siberian taiga, or the birthplace of civilization, a backward country, or a forge of technical progress? Why are 70% of the habitable territories absolutely uninhabited? Some kind of colony or a powerful state, capable of giving a rebuff to any enemy. The homeland of equality, brotherhood, communism, the freest country in the world, or a prison of nations where all people are helpless and powerless. What's wrong with you, Russia? You're on the Epoch of Distrust channel with Mikhail Kalmykov. And now we will try to figure out this complicated issue from the point of view of the threads of mythological connections and assumptions started in my videos a year ago and continued throughout the entire 2024 year. Therefore, I warn all skeptics and critics in advance that the entire following story is just a product of my imagination. Treat it as a fantastic story. Well, if you want to know the whole chain of events, then watch the previous videos. Over the past time, there have been many comments with questions about why I deliberately avoid the topic of Russia in my analysis of mythological themes. Well, with the exception of perhaps the role of Tagnirog in the Trojan War. In fact, it's quite simple. It's just impossible to cover everything about Russia in one video. But we will still try to take a look at least at a part of it with you. Many nuances and details needed to be devoted to entire additional videos. For example, as we saw with you when applying ancient maps to the globe and their projection onto modern reality in the video Refuting Cartography. The modern territory of Russia is not at all what it used to be. In particular, there was a huge strait, a spillway, which divided America and Asia, and this is not the modern Bering Strait. It did not exist at all then. The territory of modern Kamchatka, Anadyr, Kolyma. They were all part of the American mainland. In fact, they are now part of the North American lithospheric plate, which, in fact, confirms the conclusions made on the basis of the application of ancient maps. The boundary between the continents was much wider and went far to the west, starting in the north, somewhere in the Kolyma River area, further along the Kolyma territory, and ending in the south, somewhere in the Sea of Okhotsk in the Gizhigin Bay area. And then, passing through Kamchatka, dividing it in half. In fact, Kamchatka itself did not exist back then. The current state of the continents was formed as a result of a tidal wave mixed with dirt, clay and mountain rocks, which was formed from the fall into the Arctic Ocean of a huge cosmic lump. As a result, the old spill was completely silted up and became a desert. Thus, a layer of eternal permafrost was formed, the tundra of the Putorana Plateau, some mountain ranges and volcanoes of the Far East. But having silted up the old strait, the rushing wave washed out a new one, which we now see as the Bering Strait. I understand it's a bold statement, but all the details are in my video Debunking Cartography. Although there is one detail I didn't mention then. It turns out the contour of the shoreline of the old strait has been preserved at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Don't believe me, here it is. Remains. So it turns out that the territory of Russia, starting roughly from Arkhangelsk Perm, all of Siberia, was literally washed away by streams of water, mixed with dirt, clay and sand. In itself, nothing alive, at least on a massive scale, was left there, only bone remains and eternal frost. And this happened relatively recently. In any case, a large number of old photos have been preserved where the territory of Siberia is practically devoid of not only taiga, but any vegetation at all. The forests, taiga, that we see now are 20 to 30 years old, and this fact is impossible not to notice. In fact, almost all alternativists, one way or another, drew attention to this. But in addition to the trees, there is confirmation that there was a completely different climate and ecosystem there not so long ago. For example, Far Eastern tigers. It's surprising that until now, few have paid attention to the fact that Amur tigers have a black-orange color, which absolutely does not correspond with the harsh snowy conditions of their habitat. It's hard to imagine how such a color could have appeared in a white, snowy climate. This is characteristic of southern species. The only exception is perhaps the red fox. It also does not change its color in winter. And scientists explain this by the fact that neither prey nor natural enemies of the fox, predatory birds, distinguish the red color. It seems gray to them, but then a logical question arises. Why then shouldn't foxes be actually gray, like the rest of the animals from their habitat? Why such complexities? But what if, like tigers, the red color of foxes appeared as a result of other reasons in a different climate, and with a sharp change in climate, it simply did not interfere and therefore remained? In my opinion, this looks more logical and simpler. In addition, Amur tigers are dying out. And this also speaks to the fact that they are not living in the climate they have evolved under for millions of years. The presence of huge deposits of almost fresh mammoth tusks also confirms both a completely different ecosystem before the catastrophe and its relative recency. Elephants and tigers live in the same climate where, obviously, tigers and mammoths lived. This is the remnants of one and the same pre-catastrophic ecosystem. Another piece of the puzzle has survived to us in folk tales, about which I also spoke in the film about Pushkin's fairy tales. In them, Alexander Sergeyevich accurately tells about what happened, even establishing the territory and direction of the strike. In fact, the well-known fairy tale about the Lukomori indicates the place quite precisely. For a long time, this country was considered a myth, a figment of Pushkin's imagination, but the subsequent finding of this very Lukomori on ancient maps accurately shows this place. The Ob region is now an absolutely lifeless territory, where only bears and oil companies rule, and a few local residents. On old maps, these people are referred to as Samoyeds or Aztecs, which is interesting, because on old maps they are considered different peoples. The Samoyeds live further north, where the climate and conditions are so harsh that eating their deceased comrades begins to seem justified, while the Aztecs live further south. But both remind us of a past global catastrophe. The very word Aztec is derived from the word remnant, all that was left of a people who lived in this territory. And this people, this state, certainly existed. Not only Pushkin's tales about Lukomori tell us about this, but also numerous ancient maps. Moreover, in the earliest times, these people were called Scythians. Of course, official history, geology, archaeology will give us long and clearly formulated answers to all these questions. and it's pointless to argue with scholars about this. Higher educational institutions simply beat out the desire to check the written truths from their graduates. Although the scientific principle is clearly stated in the formulation itself, no opinion can be true solely on the authority of the declarant. Any statement can and should be subject to doubt. But only a few individuals are capable of doing this after graduating from universities. Therefore, I will not dwell too much on my previous arguments, but will only present one single example, which it seems no one has seen so far. Look, the farthest north of Russia is the Nenets Autonomous Okrug, where the same Samoyeds lived. Now there are practically none of them there. 70% of the population are Russians, another 11% are Komi and Germans, and the remaining 8% are all other nationalities. The capital of the region is the city of Naryan Mar, founded and built already in the Soviet Union. It was laid in 1931 as a village, and since 1935 it has been considered a city. The name of the city Naryan Mar, and it appeared on the 10th of March 1931. The Nenets District Council brought up the issue of renaming the village of Beloshchely, as the name of the future capital of the region should be understandable to the Nenets population. Out of the three proposed options, Naryan Mar, Red City, Idai Mard, New City and Nenets, Naryan Mard was the most sonorous and understandable. October 10, 1931. The All-Russian Central Executive Committee in the Central Executive Committee issued a decree on assigning the newly formed settlement the name Naryan Mard. This is the official version, and naturally any official will tell it. But watch your hands. First, if Mart was a city in Nenets, why is it now called Mar? Where did D go? We calmly call it Salihart, and the letter D doesn't disappear anywhere. But suddenly two disappeared from Mart. The Nenets did not have cities? Then where did they get the word in their language that means city? Do you think there was a word for city or wasn't there? It's not the point, right? And now the cherry on the cake. On the ancient maps of the 16th, 17th centuries, for example, by the same Nicholas Witzen, the modern Karasi near the city of Naryan Mar is called, correctly Naryan Mar, more precisely Naryan Mar. Coincidence? I can definitely say that it's not. And the name Naryan Mar is not from Nenets, but from Latin or Swedish, or maybe even from Russian. And it doesn't mean Red City, but Naryan Mar. Mer in Latin is sea, and in Russian it's also sea. But what the word Naryan or Nyaren means, I couldn't find out. However, the fact remains a fact. The city's name hides a renamed name C, in which there was, I don't know what was there, but obviously something very important, which cannot be forgotten. That's why this spectacle was invented with the Nenets language and the Nenets name of the city. There is, however, one detail. On the site of the present city of Naryan Mar, there was a certain city of Pustozersk, a little to the west, about 20 kilometers away. Nevertheless, judging by the map, the city is large. That is, there were no Nenets there already at the time of Peter, but there was a large Russian city of Pustozersk not far from the shore of the Nenets Sea. The city was founded by Yakov during an expedition under the command of the warlords Kurbsky Ushat and Vasily Zabolotsky Brajnik in the year 1499. And Yakov stood on the cape of Lake Pusto. However, on all old maps, this city is not on the cape, but on an island in the center of the lake. And this city existed until the year 1924. It was finally abandoned in 1954. The residents reportedly moved to Naryan Mar. Possibly, due to the desolation in the Nenets language, a word could have appeared that means city. But still, there is only one city. And, As our official science teaches us, it would have been much easier for the local residents to come up with a name in such a case, resonating with the name of this one and only town of Pustozersk. Or simply the Russian word for city migrated into this language. But no, somehow a mart appeared, so the Nenets language perhaps is simply invented like many others. In any case, the meaning of the word city, like mart, was definitely artificially added to this language. By the way, this map also shows a huge spill there, where we found it thanks to the application of Mercator's maps to the globe, and other French maps of those times also show a spill. There is no Kamchatka, and at the place of the Lena River, there is also a sea. Moreover, not the Lena Sea, but the Linsk Sea. And again a skirmish. The official version asserts that the name of the Lena River again originates from local dialects. Something like Eliu ine linea, which means big water, or even from the Russian lazy. The name was given in the early 16th century by the Russian pioneer Pantelimon Demidovich Pianda. And here again I don't understand, is the name Evenki or Russian? But one way or another, on the maps of Nicholas Whitson, in the place of the Lena River, there is a huge spill, which is called the Lena Sea. Here is another map, also by Whitson, but made much later, especially for Tsar Peter I. It also has the Lena Sea, but the Norian Sea is already missing. Now it is called the Tartarium Sea. And here is another map of the Russian Empire, or Muscovy, made according to the information of Nicholas Whitson by the cartographer Nicholas de Fer, 1688 years. That is again before Peter, and there is also the Nerian Sea. So after Peter I, this sea began to change its name and turned into the Tartar Sea and now into the Kara Sea. By the way, where did the name Kara come from? And again, the official version tells us about such a name in honor of the Kara River, which flows into this sea. It makes sense. That's how it usually goes. For example, the Pechora Sea became so from the Pechora River. But earlier, the Kara Sea was the Tartar, meaning Tartaria disappeared around this time. But the Kara River appeared, and hence the Kara Sea. But again, it doesn't add up. Why should the Great Sea be named after a tiny stream that flows into it against the background of dozens of others, exactly the same? When there's a huge river nearby, for example, why then not call the sea Opsky? Why do we even need this tiny stream? And where did it get such a name, and what does it mean? The official version says, but in fact this time it says nothing at all. There are only guesses that it is again from the Nenets word hara, which means twisted, but this is not accurate. For some reason, officials call all rivers either rivers or twisted, and necessarily in some local dialect. All the cities around are Russian, but the river bears a name from the local dialect. Or maybe the river was named after the Russian word Kara and sea, respectively, Karsko, that is, sea, Kara of the sky. Indeed, yes, according to my assumptions, somewhere here was the border of the Kara of the sky catastrophe, but the flood itself only started here. This was the border. The main mass went further, filling the old strait between Russia and America and forming a new strait much further, Beringov. Yes, all these transformations of words are quite a muddy and slippery road. But at least in the case with Narian Mar, I am 100% sure in the deliberate hoax and the search for justifications in local dialects in order to cover the name of the city, Narian Mar, with a plausible theory reinforced by a document of the Central Committee of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But let's remember all this fireworks of renaming with names and titles and move on. One of the main questions that may arise in the viewer sounds like this. Why the same disaster, the same wave? In one place, a wide space rift fell asleep between the motherboards, and a little further on the contrary, the narrow Bering Rift broke through. What kind of acrobatics is this? So here we read, and here we wrap the fish. What are these double standards? Where is the logic? Indeed, this may seem at first glance at least strange. In fact, everything is very simple. The asteroid rolling across the North Pole raised a huge wave in front of it. It consisted of a huge amount of sedimentary rocks from Earth, lifted from the ocean floor, from islands or the mainland of Arctida, or from the disintegrated parts of the asteroid itself. It doesn't matter. He pushed this mass in front of him, gave it a huge impulse, and it went as any liquid is supposed to, where there is the least resistance, that is, into a wide spill. But this spill was sideways from the movement of the asteroid. The main impulse was directed straight ahead of it. Sideways. Mostly it was the heavier stuff that went, that is, clay, sand and rock. It filled the entire spill, forming a new dry land. Besides, the dirtier masses were heavier, the water moved slower and settled faster. After the entire spill was filled with rock to a decent height above sea level, and almost all the mass of the churned heavy rock had settled, the water had to go where there was the least resistance. Further, much further, in the course of the asteroid's movement. Fortunately, it has now become much lighter and faster, having freed itself from impurities and clay. And now, this already cleaner and lighter structure has pierced the Bering Strait, formed Kamchatka, the Kuril Islands line, and the Aleutian Islands line. So, the old shore of the Pacific Ocean, the Lena Sea, was filled from above with broad rocks and dirt, and instead of the seashore a wide river was formed, which was named Lena, and that's why they are called the famous Lena Pillars. These mysterious rock formations are only found on the right bank of the river, as the right bank was originally the sea, which was eroded by the front part of the stream. It was eroded by the liquid. When it stopped and began to dry out, and the moisture began to leave it, the known mass began to crack and crumble, forming such strange pillars from the dried material. By the way, perhaps that's why there is such an overwhelming amount of gold and diamonds on the banks of the Lena River. They were simply brought by the current. Together with the rock extracted from the depths of the mantle, all of Yakutia is literally a gold-bearing rock torn from the depths of the North Pole. Exactly. The same explanation applies to the large amount of gold in Alaska. It's just a continuation of the same current. By the way, it's not excluded that the asteroid itself was made up of a significant portion of gold. But that's just my imagination. And from this comes an interesting conclusion. If you're looking for the cities of an ancient civilization, you need to do it up to the Lena River and further east. Absolutely makes no sense. Because it was the bottom of the ancient Pacific Ocean, and there definitely can't be any ancient cities there. Tartary, for more than a decade, the debate about the great Tartary Empire, which almost all of Asia was part of, except for a small part of Europe, has not subsided. About Tartary is written in the British Encyclopedia. It is depicted on hundreds of different maps throughout the centuries. It has left its mark in our history, in the form of the mythical Tatar-Mongol yoke. Some say it was a single empire, some say it was a territory derived from the word. There are many guesses and versions. Dozens and even hundreds of books have been written on the subject of Tartaria. For example, Andrei Kadikchansky has a whole 3-volume set called The Small Encyclopedia of Great Tartaria, which summarizes a large part of our knowledge about this country. However, I want to look at this empire from a different perspective, which probably occurred to almost all viewers, but is little illuminated in the mass media. From the point of view of Greek mythology, look, absolutely everyone sees some connection between the name Tartaria and the Greek Tartarus, the kingdom of the dead. It seems quite obvious. Tatar is the kingdom of the dead in the singular, and Tartaria is a place where there are many Tartars. And indeed, all this vast territory is still very sparsely populated and unsuitable for life. In any case, such is the public opinion. However, when I traveled in 2000 years in Siberia, I noticed that its southern part, for example, Omsk, Novosibirsk, has a climate little different from the climate of Moscow. And in a good sense of the word. It's understandable that the depth into the continent leaves a certain imprint, and winters there are harsher, but the summer is quite hot. The space is vast, and with good management it's quite possible to live very comfortably there. The only thing that hinders this is the constant freezing cold. And if there's practically none in Omsk or Novosibirsk, then north of Surgut and east of Krasnoyarsk it starts like a solid carpet. And interestingly, the width doesn't play any role in this. This very permafrost is not only beyond the Arctic Circle, but it goes as a solid filling zone all the way to the border with China, up to 50 degrees wide in the Chita and Khabarovsk regions, and to understand, this is the width of the Volgograd or Rostov region. How could eternal permafrost form at such warm latitudes? Moreover, pay attention, for example, to the city of Bodaibo. It is almost at the same latitude as Moscow, and the northernmost border of Baikal is exactly at the latitude of Moscow. And in both places, the level of eternal permafrost, solid eternal permafrost, ranges from 20 to 250 meters. Can you imagine 250 meters of eternal permafrost under Moscow? That's the height of an 80-story building, and it's completely solid ice.
How is he formed?
The distribution map of permafrost also leads to thoughts about a huge wave coming from the North Pole, and exactly in the center of this wave are the Lena and Indigirka rivers. And here is what ancient Greek mythology tells us about Tartarus. Tartarus in ancient Greek mythology is the deepest abyss, located under the kingdom of Hades. According to Hesiod, it served as a prison, where after the Titanomachy, the war of the gods, Zeus cast down Kronos and the Titans, and where their stern gods, the Hecatonchires, children of Uranus, were kept. In Tartarus, the Cyclopes were also forged. It's a dark abyss, as far from the surface of the earth as the earth is from the sky. According to Hesiod, a bronze anvil would fall from the surface of the earth to Tartarus in 9 days. Tartarus is the lower sky. Tartarus was surrounded by a triple layer of darkness from the god Erebus, and bronze walls with bronze gates from the god Poseidon. These gates were guarded by the stern giants, the Hecatonchires. Behind them lurked the Titans and ancient monsters, defeated by the Olympians. As Hesiod writes, anyone who falls there through the bronze gates will only reach the bottom of Tartarus after a year. And that's only with the help of strong winds blowing in the darkness. In itself, this is a fantasy of an ancient Greek author, designed to scare readers. And what if not? Let's break it down point by point. Point 1. Tartarus is a pit under the realm of Hades. Well, I don't know where the realm of Hades is, but under the eternal mire, some ancient kingdom is definitely buried. And not just one. At least a kingdom of buried and frozen animals, and at most an entire ancient civilization. Point 2. Tartaria serves as a prison for the ancient gods Kronos and other titans. Obviously, if an ancient civilization was buried under a huge layer of ice, it's a peculiar prison. Point 3. Tartarus is surrounded by the copper walls of the god Poseidon. The word copper confuses many. Everyone tries to find the copper doors in the copper wall, but they forget that these are not just copper walls, but the copper walls of Poseidon. That is, in any case, something related to water, and the eternal dampness is the wall of Poseidon. And it's copper because it's covered with a layer of earth made of chalk, clay, and including metals. Earth clay of a reddish copper color. That's why the doors are copper. This layer of earth does not allow the frost to melt, covering it from the solar heat. and thus seals the wall of ice permanently. Point 4 in Tartar are enclosed cyclops. Sounds quite fantastic, but we all know perfectly well that from the eternal permafrost and without stopping, mammoth skeletons are continuously mined, or rather their tusks. And what about the skulls? Have you ever seen a mammoth skull without tusks? Here it is. I don't know about you, but the image of a cyclops is immediately born in my head looking at such a thing. And so the ancient Greeks could have seen similar skulls and made similar conclusions. Point 5. This dark abyss, which is as far from the surface of the earth as the sky is from the earth. According to Hesiod, a copper anvil would have fallen from the surface of the earth to Tartarus in 9 days. This point also sounds quite fantastic, but let's remember the story of the squadron of bombers that landed on the ice of Greenland during the war. They fell into the ice and began their long, multi-year flight down to the bottom of the ice shelf. And nevertheless, they fell quite quickly. In a few decades, they fell 90 meters. So it matches up quite well here. Thus, it is quite possible to consider the ancient Greek Tartar as an accurate definition of the territory now occupied by the Russian Federation, and before it the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and before that the Russian Empire. A vast part of the land buried under a layer of dirt, clay and ice, with thousands of destroyed cities, millions of destroyed lives, a land of the dead. The hell border separating this hell and Europe runs along the Ural Mountains. By the way, in light of this event, the name of Europe, as well as the Greek myth about it, begins to look completely different. According to the myth, Zeus kidnapped Europe, who was playing on the seashore, and took her to the west, to the island of Crete. Actually, the very name Europe is a Phoenician word for west, but that's not exactly accurate. In any case, looking at some murky hints of Europe being saved from the water, that is, the saved territory. There is another mention of Europe in Aeschylus's tragedy The Suppliants, or Europe. It's interesting that it also describes the Trojan War, and all its content, very conveniently, is completely lost. Only 2 pages remain which talk about Europe. However, we know that the Suppliants were a people who also fought on the side of the Trojans. And although historians place it somewhere in the center of modern Turkey, but in case if Troy was in the place of Taganrog, the Koreans also fit well. As one of the peoples who came to the aid of Troy, along with the Scythians and Amazons. And the Kara River, which we discussed a little earlier, could well denote their homeland. Moreover, there are legends about the mysterious people of Kara. River of the Dead. According to legends, to get to the kingdom of the dead, one must cross the river Styx and ascend its flow. This is known from school from those same Greek myths. But where exactly this river is located, no one among the dead has known to this day. Some believe it's in the far west, some in the east. There's even a real little river named Styx in the city of Perm. History tells us that it got its name in the 18th century because it flowed past the city cemetery. But that's not accurate. The fact is that the name was given to it more than 200 years ago. It's clear that a small river can't really be a river of the kingdom of the dead. However, as they say, there's no smoke without fire. And we know about one river that separates Europe from Asia. To be precise, it separates the surviving part of the continent, known as Europe, from the dead, perished part, now known as Asia. And on old maps it is called Tartary Tartar. And this is the Ural River. If there is any river that separates the kingdom of the dead and the living, it can only be this one. But this is just a vocal assertion, based only on my guesses, even if they are obvious. Well then, let's try to find some confirmations in history and mythology. We already remember from my series of videos about Alexander the Great that the mythical river Granik, which he crossed on his way to mythical Persia, was the Ural River. The name Ural is an anagram of the word Granik from ancient Greek and means roughly the same. Granik is a stone, granite, the Ural River is a stone river. Granite, just like the Ural Mountains, are granite. After this crossing with the army of Alexander the Great, strange things began to happen. For example, Arrian writes that his soldiers were cold, especially at night, and they covered themselves with 3 cloaks to not freeze. In the map of Siberia by Semen Remezov from the year 1700, there is also a mention of a place where the army of Alexander the Great hid some of their weapons. Another interesting nuance relates to the wanderings of Odysseus and his misadventures at the end of the Trojan War. I detailed this episode in a series of videos about ancient gods and the Trojan War. At the very end of Odysseus' wanderings across the Black Sea, they found themselves near Chimeria again, and it was there that the river Styx began its course. Since the kingdom of the Cimmerians was from the Azov Sea to the Caspian, it probably refers to some river that flows specifically into the Caspian Sea, not the Black or Azov Sea. Well, simply because if it were the shores of Crimea and the Don River again, Homer would probably have said so. Troy and Tanais, but no, he clearly meant another city and another river, even though not far away. So it's the Caspian, and the city located there on the shore is most likely Astrakhan. So the river Styx is the Volga. Of course, that's possible. But the thing is, first of all, it was then called the Ra River, as follows from the same French maps, and secondly, it flows into the Caspian Sea, and the second river is the Ural, and it is definitely the border that separates the kingdom of the dead and the living. During its existence, this river has changed its name several times. This is a well-known fact. It used to be called Yaik, and Catherine, a great devotee of Greek mythology, changed this name to Ural. And yet, we are assured that she used the word Jacobi from the Bashkir language for this, but I, for one, do not believe that Catherine knew the Bashkir language. Greek, yes, definitely. Plus, she was familiar with the method of encryption and the inversion of words. And the Bashkir language, with all due respect to the Bashkirs, I highly doubt. But the main thing is not this, but the fact that in the 17th, 18th centuries, many cards were published in Britain and France. The Paris Academy of Sciences published maps of Russia specifically for Tsar Peter, as well as for his predecessors. It is from these French maps that we learned that the old name of the Volga River is Ra. It is written directly there, the Volga River or Ra. But few people know that this same typography also published maps of Siberia. One of these maps is the map of Nicolas de Lille from the year 1706. On it, in the highest resolution, you can see the entire old territory up to the watershed, and the Sea of Lensk, and the eponymous river, and Lake Baikal, and all the modern cities around it, Irkutsk, Bratsk, Lensk, Barguzin, and many others. And not as strongholds or fortresses, no, they are designated on the map as large cities. So on this map is designated the Ural River, and it is called on this map, attention, the river Yaik or Tik. That is, the original name of the Ural River is not Yaik but Tik, River Tik. If you put the name in quotes, it turns out to be Styx. Of course, this is my allowance, but we have seen more than once with you how historians juggle words like, for example, with the Volga River, which is called Ra, or with the Illyrian language, which on the surface turned out to be quite Russian, lyrical. Hence, the Cyrillic alphabet is just a reversed forward and lyric. In addition, it suddenly becomes clear that there is not a single papyrus or stone slab with exactly such an early inscription of the word Styx as it is now. This name, like many mythological concepts, originated in oral tradition, and its written fixation refers to a later period when the Greek alphabet was already created. And in this case, instead of writing tik with separate letters K and S, the Greeks used one letter, combining two letters K, S, I at once. In any case, on several points, this river is well suited for the role of the mythical Styx. Firstly, according to Homer's description. Secondly, following the traces of the Macedonian campaigns. And thirdly, purely empirically. It is this river that separates Europe from the kingdom of the dead. It is beyond it that the mythical Tartary begins, and no less mythical Tartar kingdom of the dead of perished civilizations. By crossing this very river, a person crosses the line between saved Europe and destroyed Asia. Numerous explorers from Europe have been striving to get there throughout the centuries. They can be understood, after all. After a catastrophe, it is necessary to find out what happened to the great states of Tartary. And these scouts definitely showed the complete destruction of the territory, then, even without forests, practically deserted, with rare hearts of survivors and a huge number of remains and bones of dead animals and people. The same, Sedgwick and Moore Chase expedition. I was so impressed by this that I named the entire period of the stratigraphic table they invented after that place, which we still live by. And the event was called the Great Permian Extinction. It is considered to be the largest extinction in the history of the planet. Not just animals died, almost 60% of all biological families died out, 80% of biological genera, not to mention species. The catastrophe was simply horrifying, but it took place 250 million years ago, apparently so that this catastrophe would not conflict with the new history. However, Adam Sedgwick and Roderick Murchison conducted their expedition in the early to mid-19th century in the 1840s and 40s. I have a more detailed separate video on this topic. It's called the Permian Extinction. And before this expedition, no one had any idea what was happening in those territories. By the way, here's another moment. We've already understood with you that the first name of the Ural River was not Yaik, but Tik or Stiks. Well, yes, God be with him, but the second name is definitely Yaik. What's wrong with it? You judge for yourself. If you search the internet for where the name of the Yaik river came from, historians will again tell us that it is a Turkish, Bashkir or Tatar name, meaning wide-spreading or something of the sort. Why in this case they didn't call the Volga or Opwaya Ik, I don't know. And why one Bashkir name Yaik was suddenly replaced with another Bashkir name Ural, I also don't know. Okay, God bless. But we've all heard of the town of Yaik, or simply the town Yaik. Well, it was also the center of the Pugachev uprising. Yes, it's a fixed fact. The Cossack army during the Pugachev uprising was located precisely in the town of Yaik, and now it's correspondingly the city of Uralsk. But why was this town named so strangely? Some kind of egg town? Why not just Yaik? After all, sometimes they still call it that. Alright, history tells us that it was founded as far back as in 1636, which means it simply has to be on old maps. And yes, it does exist, for example, on the map of Nicolas de Fer from 1685. It is there, just not where it is now, 430 kilometers south of its current location, right on the shore of the Caspian Sea, where the Ural flows into it. Exactly the same as Astrakhan on the Volga. But with 1,700 years, the city of Yaik disappears from this place on the maps, and after some time, some city of Sirachik appears. But it didn't end there. Now the city of Sirachik also disappeared and moved somewhere to the northeast of Iran. And on this troubled site, the city of Guryev appeared, which in the first year of the 1990 Kazakhstan government renamed to Atirau. That is, we are restoring order. First, the river was called Tik, and at its mouth stood the city of Yaik. Strange personalities have always been attracted here, both Stepan Razin and Emelian Pugachev. Then someone for some reason thought of renaming the river, and the name was changed in honor of the city of Yaik. Exactly like that, not the other way around. But then some other trouble happened, and the river was renamed again to Ural. The city's name itself was moved 34 kilometers upstream and further north. And the city that was at the mouth of the Ural and was called Yaik, according to Vitsin's maps, was simply destroyed for some time. And after some time, Sirachi Guryev appeared in its place, and then Atirau. So you want to ask, what is all this fuss about? So, we have a justified assumption with you that the mythical Tartar kingdom of Ada is not entirely mythical and has specific geographical coordinates. And this means that there should be other, more ancient evidence of this location. Let's check. Look, in ancient mythology, it is said that the kingdom of the dead is ruled by Zeus's native brother Hades from here, by the way, and the name went from, and Hades was not always the ruler of hell, he was put to rule the kingdom of the dead by Zeus. Already, after the Titanomachy, that is, the battle of the gods, however, Tartarus was a place of reference and departure after death and before the Titanomachy. Indeed, it is not exactly known who then ruled it. The main thing is not this, but the fact that after this very Titanomachy and the appointment of Hades as the main kingdom of the dead, he was assisted by additional demigods and entities, in particular the so-called Hekatonkeres, mythical elders and giants. They also had 50 heads each, but these are details. That is, we just need to find where such are encountered in mythology, and the point is that they are indeed encountered. The first thing that comes to mind is, of course, Indian mythology and its multi-armed god Shiva, if not Hekatonkeres. By the way, no one knows the exact number of Shiva's arms at the moment. It is officially considered that there are 4 of them, that is 2 pairs. However, there are images and statues where he has 6 arms, 8 arms, 16 and even 18, like on this sculpture. In other words, no one has seen the exact number. The main thing is that there are many of them. But the main thing is that many of you know Indian mythology, secondarily many meanings and whole words in Sanskrit exactly correspond to Russian. And the geographical names of places mentioned in the Mahabharata, for example, about the same battle at Kurukshetra, have no connection to real Indian rivers and mountains. But there are plenty of them in Siberia. In Russia, there are several rivers and lakes with names Ganga, many derived from Ind, Indigirka, Indirka, River Sita, Shiva, Lake Rama, and so on. In the Krasnoyarsk region, there is a village called Balakta. Every time you pass by it on the highway, you get into a fog, regardless of the time of year. Such is the peculiarity of this place. Is it surprising that in Sanskrit, Balakta means fog? In the Mahabharata, rivers are mentioned, for example Aksha, which is not in India, but it really exists in the basin of the river Aki or the river Kubja, which is not in India, but is in Russia. And there are dozens of such coincidences, if not hundreds. Whole chapters from the Mahabharata coincide with Russian descriptions of places, for example according to the Mahabharata. In Yamuna the rivers Jala and Upajala flow, and in AKU the rivers Jala and Upa still flow to this day. Coincidence. But also in AKU and in the Indian Yamuna, the Para river and the Pra river flow. All this was noticed in its time by Svetlana Zharnikova, a Soviet and Russian ethnographer, candidate of historical sciences. I remembered this just to make it clear that Indian culture is secondary and its roots go back to Russian, Siberian India and Persia. to where Alexander the Great actually went. And I did this to understand that the many-armed Shiva is also a part of the echoes of ancient myths and tales. And now we can look at another European actor who was tearing our territory deep before Peter the Great and during Peter the Great himself. I've already mentioned him in my earlier videos and even at the beginning of this one. This is Nicholas Whitson. I remind you, this is a Dutch politician, cartographer, entrepreneur, burgomaster of Amsterdam, and of course a high-ranking Mason. He clearly had some very old maps, which he redrew. And based on them, he created the book Northern and Eastern Tartary. In this book, he describes Siberia all the way to the Pacific Ocean and attaches maps and engravings to the records. And these engravings have just about everything. Here, for example, is the Indian god Ganesha with an elephant's head. And here is the prototype of Shiva himself, the Vulcan Hekatonchirus, specifically Hekatonchirus, because his arms are simply not from this world. And this, in my opinion, is direct evidence that Tartarus was considered not mythical, but a real Tartarus, the kingdom of Hades. There are the river Styx, the volcanoes of Hekatonchirus, and the dead civilizations. Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin also considered the territories mentioned in the tales to be quite real, and as it turned out later, Lucomoria was indeed a state that existed in the past. But not only it, there are also unwritten tales of Pushkin, which have only been preserved in sketches and which other writers have picked up on, about the Berendeyev kingdom. For example, Vasily Zhukovsky, even during Pushkin's lifetime, based on tales told to Alexander Sergeyevich by Arina Rodionovna, wrote a tale about Tsar Berendey. The plot is quite unattractive. The unexpected son of the Tsar, having grown up, goes to the kingdom of Koshchei, to whom he was promised even before his birth. There he falls in love with Koshchei's daughter and runs away with her. Pushkin himself did not manage to write a fairy tale about Koshchei, but he mentioned him as one of the characters of Lucomorie. There Tsar Koshchei smells of gold, there is the Russian spirit, there Russia smells. Another fairy tale by Alexander Ostrovsky, written 40 years later, is called The Snow Maiden. And there too the story is about the Berendey kingdom, about the daughter of the cold god Moros, who went to live with people and then melted. What is common in these fairy tales? Firstly, in both of them, the action takes place in some Berendey kingdom. Secondly, both tales talk about the fact that next to the Berendey kingdom is the territory of the gods, and one of these very gods rules this kingdom. In one case it's Koshchei, in the other it's Moros. And in both tales the action is associated with frozen water. In the first case, the kingdom itself is underwater, but at the same time Ivan moves and exists there comfortably. This is possible in underwater caves. In the second case, the Snow Maiden herself is literally made of ice, that is, from frozen water. And in both tales, it talks about the daughter of this very god. And, strangely enough, the Berendeyev kingdom is also designated on ancient maps. That is, it also really existed. And now, this place is located in the northeast of the Arkhangelsk region. That is, it is exactly the territory of Naryan-Mar. Naryan-Mar is the Berendeyev kingdom, and it borders the zone of permafrost with the zone of eternal frost with the kingdom of the dead. It turns out that Moros, Koshchei and Hades are one and the same character. By the way, the expression Koshchei over the gold acquires a literal meaning. As we know, a gigantic water mud flow brought a huge amount of gold and diamonds from the north, which are still mined there in industrial quantities. When did the transformation of Tartar into the kingdom of Hades occur? The question is not insignificant, but we certainly have some hints. Look, first of all, Hades reigned in Tartarus not immediately, but after the Titanomachy, that is, the battle of the gods before the Trojan War. And after it, there was a whole period in human history when many were eager to go there to see what was left. The same Alexander the Great or Nicholas Witzen, Roderick Murchison with Adam Sedgwick, and before them the combat reconnaissance groups of Ermak, Khabarov, Dezhnev, and many others. At the same time, a new history of rock climbing was being written. Miller, Schleusser, and Bayer were directed to us to write a new history specifically for us and advance the Norman theory. Various cartographers such as Mercator-Witzin, Guillaume de Lille relied on maps from ancient sources before Peter. On all of them, Asia ends approximately at the 50th parallel. Instead of the Lena River, there is the Lena Sea, although the Lena River itself exists but much smaller than today. Instead of the Amur River, there is the Amur Sea. By the way, it's written in French, which is characteristic of Mer d'Amour, that is, the Sea of Love. This is interesting in that cartographers like de Lille wrote in Latin, but used original names. For example, New Zealand is written as New Zealand on all maps without exception.
Earth, but
in Latin. The Sea of Lensk is also written in Latin, but in Russian it's the Sea of Lensk. And so, until the year 1700, everyone oriented themselves by these old maps. But precisely from the year 1700, a sharp change occurred. After him, he hastily redrew his maps, and they took on a modern look. Numerous cities in Siberia disappeared, and new lands appeared in the east, and a new Bering Strait. The year 1700 was clearly pivotal, but that doesn't mean that the global catastrophe happened exactly then. On the contrary, most likely, people only recovered from it then and went to check in accordance with the maps to restore the destroyed trade routes. Perhaps in the year 1700 another event occurred, for example, the fall of one of the remnants of an asteroid. Repeating, but these are just hypotheses and assumptions. In any case, on the graph compiled in previous videos, we saw with you that it is precisely this year that the minimum point of the last sharp global cooling comes. Thus, it turns out that in the east, beyond the Urals, begins the territory called Tartar, later renamed to Tartary. This is the realm of Hades. This is the place from where he rules the dead souls. But it is also buried under a layer of eternal frost, covered with soil, clay, and dirt on top. Perhaps it is this shield that is called the Copper Gates. These gates have a guardian. We are with you, Russians. Anyone who begins to rule this territory quickly becomes its protector, regardless of the original intentions. Now it becomes clear why Europeans and other conquerors are drawn to Siberia, why they continually try to conquer our territory. Of course, Siberia has gold, oil, and other riches. This is the very stimulus that makes ordinary people move. Ordinary people. But behind ordinary people stand the surviving gods Zeus, Prometheus, and others. They have changed their names many times, formed their own religions, and even fight each other. But when it comes to a new campaign in the east, they all magically unite. Because the goal is one, to reach the kingdom of Hades, to what? But perhaps we will talk about this in the next episode.
Subtitles. To be continued.